Okay, so this is the empathy, the video designed to help support my Year 12 students doing the empathy task on World War One. I'll try and get through this reasonably quickly for you, but point out some of the key points that you need to be aware of. We've gone through this in class already. You've had a chance to look at previous year's work to gain an idea about the requirements. You know that there has to be a lot of detail and you have to be very specific in the empathy task. So you can't just create a nice big long narrative. You have to be very specific with things like technology and strategy and all that sort of stuff. But I'll unpack those sorts of things over the course of this video. So the first thing you need to do with the empathy task is to choose your event or your location and choose from whose perspective you're writing. So I've given you quite a lot of choice as far as event is concerned, the time frame that you can look at as far as World War One is concerned, leading up to the war, during the war, after the war, just to put it really broadly. Perspective, for example, you can choose from an infantryman, a nurse, a pilot, a photographer, one of the leaders. There's a politician. There are a lot of perspectives from that which you can choose. Depending on whose perspective you choose, that'll influence what you have to say about some of the internal and external pressures on your chosen country. So an example of this is if you're a Russian peasant and you are writing about what it's like to be on the home front in Russia in the early days of World War One, you're going to have a lot to say, and none of it is going to be good. Well, very little will be good if you're a peasant. If you're writing from the perspective of a member of the aristocracy, the views might vary a little bit. They might waver, for example. So that's just why it's important from whoever's perspective you choose will determine what you have to say about what might be happening internally in your country. What's happening in the world at large. You may also mention some of the things that led to World War One or led to that battle, just as an aside. But whatever you mention, you need to be specific. Okay, your event needs to be very specific. So you need to think carefully about the dates. If you're, say, for example, you're writing from the perspective of one of the leaders, you may actually choose to do a series of diary entries. They actually even span parts of, like a substantial timeline in the war. But if you're doing that, you need to pick key moments that were almost like turning points for that leader, all right? So that's where it's important. Otherwise, if you're choosing a battle, you may do the last days of the battle, but you would have to mention the early days of the battle as an aside so that I, as the marker, am able to feel that you're demonstrating your understanding of a course of events and what has impacted on that entire course of events and why you have the opinion you do and how it ended the way it did, basically. All right, let's keep going. So you've chosen your event. So what do you need to think about? Well, what it is, where it is, why it's happening, and who's involved. So you need dates. Who's involved, why are they involved? What's the actual physical environment like? Is it really muddy or is it really dry? Remember, not all trench systems were in muddy places. So you need to actually demonstrate some understanding about your location. So that's to put that really, really quickly. Now, I've got some great pieces of artwork here. I know you're overwhelmed by their amazingness, aren't you? All right, you also need to, you're choosing an event, write about technology. You could even, from the home front, make an observation about the technology that's being used. If you're choosing to write further on in the war, because remember early on in the war, the initial stages of the war, there was a great sense of excitement amongst most of the population, not all, of course, nothing is ever an absolute, but amongst most of the population about defending their country. And, there was that whole propaganda that fed into that sense of nationalism and, creating that sense of the other. So it made people more likely to support the war effort. So depending on what period, if you're writing from the home front or even as a soldier, depending on what period of time in the war that you're writing will impact your perspective, what you have to say. So where was I? So yes, from home front you may know about technology. So if you're talking about technology, you need to be specific. So you don't just talk about gas, you actually identify the type of gas and the effect it has had. It might have had an effect on someone near you, and you know that you've got to get your gas mask on quickly and The effect of some gases took longer to manifest than others. Others are more immediate. So think about that. So be specific. What was the technology? Who used it? When did they use it? Did another country then make their own version, which they did, often in terms of, for example, the gases. What was the name of it? I want to know, if you're mentioning machine guns, you're mentioning guns, give me the name. So you're being specific. What was the effect of that technology? So, for example, with the tanks, whilst they were very slow and cumbersome and often got bogged, the effect was that they could be very morale boosting for the soldiers, the infantrymen at first, because they would stand behind the tank and use it as a bit of shelter. And they made such a noise, it was very frightening. And I'm speaking very quickly and very generally. And why was that technology used? So, for example, if you're writing about barbed wire, what a great picture that is, who used it? Why did they use it? What was the effect? Remember we spoke about the funneling effect that the barbed wire could use on the enemy. How it slowed people down. How it was razor sharp. The artillery did very little to breaking through the barbed wire as opposed to initial thoughts. I won't tell you what battle that was. You pick your battle, you'll know. For example, types of communication. We've got, the pigeons. You might write about the pigeons they use, what worked for them. You might choose to write about flags. Flags as a communication device. In some of the fronts, on the Eastern Front, camels were used. So if you're writing from the east perspective of the Eastern Front, you would mention, and you're a soldier or a general officer, whatever, I would expect you to use the term the war of movement. If you're writing and you're writing from the perspective of someone who is involved with the Western Front, then you would talk about the stalemate, you would talk about the war of attrition, bleeding them white. You'd mention those sorts of phrases. So it's really important that you're using phrases, terminology that is specific to your particular location and period in time. There's no reason why you can't talk about bleeding them white if you're writing from the home front. Planes. How are planes used? Guns. What guns were used? What was the impact? Remember, often the number of the soldiers weren't trained very well. So what was the effect of, or hadn't had much training, what was the impact of that? Once again, the tanks, that's a lovely picture. See, look, and they were moving so slow you could have a little sleep. Well, obviously you couldn't, you know what I mean. Gas, here we go, the different types of gas, as I said, be specific, name it. The limitations of the technology, some of the strategies that were used in regard to the technology, what they hoped, what was the reality, okay, what this led to. Yeah, alrighty. So looking at who, you need to think about, or basically, who are you? Why are you feeling a certain way? And this is a lovely timeline, isn't it? It's great. So whatever your period of time is that you're writing about, how are you feeling here? Did it change here and why? So how are you feeling here? Why? How are you feeling here? Why? How are you feeling here? Why? What was happening at these points for you to feel this way, behave a certain way? What might you have observed, at these particular points in time? If you're writing from the perspective of the home front, or even if you're writing from the perspective of someone on the war front who might be writing about people at home, how are the people at home feeling? Were they happy at first? Were they sad? If so, why? What created these different emotions? And about who were these emotions directed to? Were they directed internally to the leaders, of that particular country? Were they directed externally to those that they perceived as their enemies or those that were their enemies? So, there's no reason why both emotions couldn't be felt at the same time, depending on the particular moment in time you're talking about. Even though you've chosen your particular perspective, who are the significant people at that time? Okay? You need to mention them by name. Particular general, particular ruler or Kaiser or whatever, you need to mention them by name and something about them. What you've heard, it might be I heard that they said X, Y, and Z. This means that we are, So you've got to show how you're feeling. Okay, who are the countries involved, perhaps in your particular battle? Why are they involved? What strategic importance was there? Okay. Talking about importance, so the importance of the location. Was the battle, so if we're talking about a battle, was it strategically important? Why? How long had you been there? What sorts of things had happened? Was there some historical importance to one of the countries? Okay. Was there some historical importance to one of the countries and that's why they wanted to either defend it or take it? Because that shows a greater level of analysis of the battle, or was it a combination of the two? You can mention statistics. You can say, I've heard that, or it seems like, that they tell us that only X amount of people have died, but really it seems like this much. If you're writing about the technology and how many rounds of bullets are fired, you can say, it's, continual and it feels like it's X number, whatever however many rounds there are, it seems like it's this much. So that's how you can introduce your statistics. You could be writing from the perspective of someone who is lying in a hospital. If you're in the trenches, I would recommend that you need to mention the three trench system. Okay, so there are 3 rows in the trenches. Didn't word that very well. So you've got the front trench, you've got the middle and the back trench. You need to be able to name those. Okay. If you're mentioning, the German trenches, remember the German trenches were arguably better designed than the Allied trenches. Okay, so then you need to give some details about whatever trench system you're in. If you're in a trench system, write about it. Write about the conditions and how it makes people feel. Now with your bibliography, whoops, how about if I watch what I'm doing on the page? Bibliography. You need to have one of those and it needs to be detailed, needs to be correctly formatted. Trying to see what I'm doing. And use Slaza. Okay. You can use the websites or the YouTube clips. You can use textbooks. Oops, running out of room. Great drawing, isn't it? Textbooks, etc., etc. Okay, but use Slaza though. So don't just give me a URL for a YouTube clip or a website. The YouTube clips I've used with you have all been reliable. If you get stuck with the names of any of them, let me know. But use Slaza because then you'll enter in all the details and Slaza will format the bibliographic reference for you as well as the any in-text citations that you need. Remember, it's 1,000 words, and that is that. Thank you.